Hey, welcome to Let's Unravel, and I'm your friend Christina. Thanks for stopping by. Whether you're a new listener or a friend of the podcast, I just wanted to say welcome. Since appreciation never goes out of style, I just wanted to say a big thank you for any of you that have been exercising those like, comment, and subscribe/share buttons wherever you're listening. Now, I would like to dare you today that as you find a piece of the show that strikes a chord with you, can you drop a comment on any platform you're listening on? Whether you're writing a review on Apple Podcasts or dropping a comment on Spotify or YouTube, any feedback that you have is very helpful to the show. Now, if commenting is not your thing, please feel free to give us a 5-star rating wherever you might be listening, as those ratings also go a long way on expanding our audience here for Let's Unravel. So let's jump into one of our favorite topics here at Let's Unravel. That is win of the week. So the win this week is we got a whole new lighting setup for Let's Unravel. So we no longer have to wait for the sun to come out. We don't have to be concerned about dreary days. And so lighting has just made our life so much easier here at Let's Unravel. And by our life, I mean my life. And so many of you know that I have built this podcast from scratch. And every week I have been learning something new, whether I've wanted to or not. And so lighting this week has been the biggest win. We no longer have to, like I said, anchor everything around natural sunlight, which has been awesome. So without any further ado, let's jump into our topic of the week. Or honestly, let's unravel our topic of the week. So let's unravel defying expectations. So I'm going to take you on a little side tangent over here for a second about defying expectations. When I think of the word defying, I instantly think of the song Defying Gravity, which is from that very popular Broadway musical Wicked, and it's since been turned into a movie. And I just think it's very funny how sometimes one word can be completely changed for you forever just because of like a movie or a Broadway show. And defying is definitely one of those. So if for some reason, as I said, defying expectations, the first thing you thought was defying gravity, you're not alone, because I also thought that. However, jumping back to our topic of the week, defying expectations. I'm really excited about defying expectations because this is a topic I have been wanting to talk about since I've started the podcast. We are going to dive into this theory that I have been sitting on for a while, and it comes from a revelation/epiphany that I had in my early 20s. And so something that I had started to notice a lot in my early 20s is how everybody has a very different definition or a very different look for certain words. And I noticed this the most common with these very particular words. So everybody's idea of success, dreams, ambition, failures, and having fun, those words looked very different to a lot of people I talked to. Having those things in mind, it slowly started to build this theory that I had that every person has their own dictionary of words in their mind or their head. I might define success can look very different than the way a family member might define success, another coworker that I work with might define success. It led me to this theory, like I said, about how everybody basically has a personalized dictionary of words. And what's so unique about this episode is we're not going to be talking about what the correct definition of those words are, because that would defeat the whole point of the episode. What my goal is to walk you along how I started to evaluate what these words mean to me. So you might be wondering, we're talking about a personalized dictionary of words, and we're use the title Defying Expectations. And you might be wondering why those things play together or how they work together. Ultimately, what I like to do here is I always like to provide you with a definition of a word, because this way we're laying the appropriate ground for our show. Let's look at these two words, defying expectations. Let's look at defying. I actually came across two definitions for this word. One is going to be a verb and one is going to be a noun. So for defying, the first definition, this is as if it's a verb. It means openly resist or refuse to obey. And I'll repeat that. It means openly resist or refuse to obey. Now, the second definition, this is if the word is used as a noun. It means appear to be challenging someone to do or prove something. And I'll repeat that. Appear to be challenging someone to do or prove something. Now, after looking at both of those definitions, I basically boiled it down to it's challenging or refusing something. As we move on to our next word, expectations. Expectation means a strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. And I'll repeat that. A strong belief that something will happen or be the case in the future. So defying expectations. I think when we can look at these two words, and when we look at both these words, we can see defying. Defying has to do with resist or challenge. I really want to focus on the idea of challenge. And with expectations, it has to do with a strong belief. So now that we're really laying the groundwork that defying has to do with challenging, an expectation has to do with a strong belief, we're going to be challenging some strong beliefs. And since we love to talk about hard topics, we're not surprised. And I think expectations is a funny word because it's one of those words that is right under our nose all the time. And it's used in a variety of places. So in one particular place that I've thought about is expectations is always listed on jobs. So whether you are a hiring manager and you're laying out the job expectations for a role, or whether you're someone that's actually applying for a job and you're reading what those expectations are, that's an example of where it's very clear to see that there are certain expectations for a role. What's also interesting is, so if you're the hiring manager or you're the person that applied for a job, once you get to your orientation day, one of the things they'll say to you is, let's go over your expectations, because they really want to drive home what you're expected to do within this role. Now, what's also really interesting is, have you ever gotten into a job where you know what the expectations for the role is, but then over time, it's like that the expectations grow, they evolve, and all of a sudden you started in one position and maybe you were doing just entry-level tasks, and then slowly over time, you started to have more experienced tasks, but maybe your title never changed, but the expectations of what you were doing, they changed. Now, I want you to grab a hold of this idea is expectations is the ruler we judge our experiences on. So it's the first word we need to evaluate the most. So the first thing I want you to think about with expectations and really put it into your life is, have you ever had moments when your friends recommend a restaurant for you to go eat to? And I don't know, you get really excited and you're like, you know what? Yeah, I want to try that restaurant. It's so exciting. So you take other friends or family members or whatever, you sit down at these restaurants, you pick the meal your friend recommended because it was the best chicken parm of their life, whatever the case may be. Then you sit down to eat the chicken parm and all of a sudden take one bite and you're like, this is the worst chicken parm I have ever had. All of a sudden, what you expected instantly plummets from your experience. And I think that's what's really interesting. So back to the idea that I just said, expectations is the ruler we judge our experiences on. So think about that. Your expectation, you were going based off your friend, this is the best restaurant ever. And then you eat the chicken parm and you're like, this is in fact the worst chicken parm I've ever had. And now all of a sudden your expectations, they plummet. What's so important about expectation is establishing what expectations look or how we want expectations to look in our own life. And that's by going after those keywords that I mentioned at the top of the episode. So pivoting into the heart of this episode, going back over just these ideas, every person has their own dictionary of words. So this is something that we know. Everybody defines certain words very differently. And those key words are success, dreams, ambition, failure, and even fun. So to give you another personal story, one of my favorite books growing up, it was a favorite book for a very small amount of time, was, and I'm going to sound so dorky saying this, was a dictionary. I only lasted a short amount of time because I realized at the age of 8 years old, it was very dorky when someone said, what's your favorite book? And I said, the dictionary. People laughed. So, but the reason why I loved dictionary so much was because it brought a lot of clarity. It defined words. And if you don't know what a dictionary is, I'm sorry. But basically, it's just a book with words and those words are defined. That's all that a dictionary is. There's no plot line or anything to it. It's just words and their definitions. What's really interesting is it also became this detriment to me because I would only see life in black and white. Because also when you look at a dictionaries, they're very black and white. It's just words and definitions. But something that we need to be aware of is it's great to define words. It's great to be aware of what these words mean. It's great to have clarity. Let's not forget, The world was meant to be seen in vibrant color. And that's where we need to start being aware of things such as expectations. Once you start to build this idea of what success looks like and all those other words mean to you, your expectations start to change because your expectations are set on you yourself. You're not pulling expectations from other people. So a perfect example from my life is growing up. I was always told, my mom would always tell me, she goes, you are going to hate musicals. Musicals are the worst. And my sister would say the exact same thing. So, you know, when you're young, you believe what your mom says, you believe what your sister says, and it's your first experience with the world. So you're just thinking, okay, so if they hate musicals, I probably would hate musicals. And then I saw High School Musical and I found out what a musical was. And I realized from that moment forward that if I could break out in song and dance, my life would be complete. That was my dream, was to live in a musical. And it's so funny because it goes back to expectations. My mom's expectation and my sister's expectations were, we don't like the singing and the dancing and all these different things. But my expectation was very different. I love the singing, the dancing, and all these different things. So all of a sudden, when my sister would ask me questions like, how did you like the movie The Greatest Showman? And if she didn't know, it was a musical. And I said, it was a great movie. I loved it. It's one of my favorites. And she went and sat down and watched it and realized it was a musical. She probably would have been like, oh my God, why didn't you tell me this was a musical? And that goes back to expectations. It goes back to seeing what does one person value over another. And so an analogy that I have for you that I think is going to be a little interesting. If you have played any kind of games, perfect example, let's say you sit down to play Monopoly. You're going to play a wonderful game of Monopoly with your family. And all of a sudden, they start playing, but they're playing by the rules of Uno. You'd be like, this is really confusing because all of a sudden you're not rolling dice. Someone's trying to do a reverse. Someone's trying to do a draw four. And you're like, I thought we were playing Monopoly. How am I going to buy Boardwalk if they're skipping my turn? And all these things. And that's where I want you to stop. Think about that. It sounds so ridiculous, but that's what we do in our normal day lives. We're taking other people's rule books and we're putting them into our lives and we're expecting to be playing this game of Monopoly, but when you're pulling the rule book from someone else's lives, you're pulling the expectations for someone else's lives and you're putting it on your own, all of a sudden you start to have this game identity crisis because you're like, I don't know if I'm playing Monopoly, I don't know if I'm playing Uno, I don't know if there's this weird game of Monopoly and Uno like merged together. And that's where all of a sudden it goes back to expectations. That's why it's so interesting when you watch TV shows, movies, or you even see in real life how you'll see parents start to place unfulfilled dreams or expectations onto their kids. Sometimes you might see that in regards to sports. And you see these very overzealous parents for these kids' sport teams, but they're like 6 and they're like, Johnny never loses. So you find yourself saying, it sounds like there's more going on there. The thing is, when we start to allow others' expectations to fall upon us, really what you're doing is you're taking a rule book from someone else's game. You're trying to incorporate it into your game. You end up with a weird game of Monopoly and Uno. And that's the same thing with this. Let's take it one step further. Another great example of this is art. I don't mean art like movies or TV shows. I mean art more like paintings and modern art and historical art and art in that variation. Let's say you meet someone and they say, oh, I love art. I love art museums. And you decide, okay, I'm going to take you to this art museum. And all of a sudden they walk in and they go, I don't like it. And you're like, I don't get it. It's an art museum. You said you like art museums. And they go, this is a historical art museum. I like modern art. It goes back to these ideas of you think you're on the same playing field. You think you guys have the same expectations of what an art museum is. And then you start to find out as they, goes back to that personalized dictionary, as they get into the nitty gritty of those words, you start to realize their idea of a good art museum is modern art. It's not historical art. And once again, I love it because people always say, well, art is subjective. And it's true. The words are subjective too. And that's what's also so interesting because when we think about Defying and how it had 2 definitions. It had one that was a noun and had one that was a verb. Subjective depends on how you're using it, whether it's a noun or whether it's a verb. Now, as you've noticed from multiple episodes, I always love to bring in movie examples to explain this topic. Annie was one of those movies I loved watching growing up. And it was about an orphan girl. She was left by her parents. They passed away. It didn't really seem like she was aware that they passed away, but It was later revealed that they had passed away. So she held on to this locket her parents had given her, and she was hoping, or should I say, expecting them to return. And so her expectations were always, my parents are coming back. And so through this whole movie and all the beautiful musical numbers that go along with it, is she's singing songs like The Sun Will Come Out Tomorrow, and it's all about how it's almost like she's holding on to this hope that her parents are coming back. That was the expectation. Then all of a sudden, this funny thing happens where Daddy Warbucks enters the picture, where he wants to have an orphan for the holidays. She goes along with it, and she enjoys being with him, and all the expectations that she had previously known. She had only known what it was like to be in an orphanage. She had only known what it was like to be around a bunch of kids. She had never known what it was like to live in a mansion. She had never known what it was like to have, honestly, anything. And now she had a lot of everything. Her expectations for, life really changed in that short amount of time. As time went on, and as she spent time with Daddy Warbucks and he grew to love her and decided that ultimately he wanted to adopt her, she had to come to this realization that her parents coming back wasn't actually going to be a possibility. And that goes back to the different types of expectations that you can have. And so that's where a lot of times people would say, well, you have to be realistic. You have to have realistic expectations. But then if we turn and we look at the other side of the story, where once Daddy Warbucks starts to value Annie and actually wants to adopt her, Miss Hannigan ends up coming right back into this picture where she doesn't want Annie to get adopted. She finds value in Annie when she never did before. She just wanted to use her as free labor. The reason why all of a sudden Miss Hannigan gives her a value is because Daddy Warbucks found a value in her. And if you've never seen Annie, Daddy Warbucks is like a millionaire or a very successful business owner of some sort, but basically he has a lot of money. When Miss Hannigan gets wind he wants to adopt her, it really changes her value and opinion on Annie. And that is another variation that we can look at too, where somebody might have said, well, that's unrealistic. Miss Hannigan would have looked at Annie and said, well, it's unrealistic that a millionaire Daddy Warbucks is ever going to want you. And then all of a sudden, Daddy Warbucks does want her. Oh, they only want you for the holidays. And then he goes, I want to adopt her. They can't make sense of it. It's really hard is when you play by other people's expectations, you're also including their jadedness. And that's the thing. Like you look at Miss Hannigan, she didn't have an easy life. You can see that easily from the movie. So she's projecting her jadedness onto Annie, saying he's never going to want you. And then when he does want her, her mind doesn't know how to comprehend it because her personalized dictionary of words doesn't line up with this scenario. And so that is why it's so important to keep this open mind of what expectations look like. That's why it's so important to define those words such as success, dreams, ambition, all of them, because they all play a part in expectations and how you want to set those expectations for your life. Now, I've talked about a little bit of these ideas in our very first episode, and I believe I mentioned that previously. And one of the other things I had mentioned in our very first episode is I talked about friends, and I had talked about the character Rachel, and I still think it's so important to incorporate her character in this episode as well, because when you look at Rachel, she enters Friends, the very first season, and what is she doing? She's running away from the altar. She doesn't want to get married because why was she even getting married? Because those were expectations her family was trying to put on her. They had said, get married, he'll provide for you. You'll have a nice life. You'll have the boat. You'll have this, you'll have that. And then what does she end up doing? She runs away to New York to the coffee house. She finds all of her friends in the coffee shop per usual. And so when Rachel comes storming into this coffee shop, she changes her entire life in a moment. She changes all the expectations, and you see it because when she comes running in a wedding dress, you can tell she didn't plan it out. She just got fed up with living by someone else's expectations. But what's so cool, I don't remember exactly what episode it was, but there's an episode where her sister comes to town and says that Rachel has made her father so proud. Why? Because she went outside of what these norms were. And in the moment, her family didn't understand it. And in the moment, her father was really angry. Somewhere later on in the seasons, all of a sudden she's finding out, oh, her father is actually really proud of her. Why? Because she went out and she made something of herself. The only way she was able to do that was by setting her own expectations. When you look at the very first episode of Friends and you see Rachel, and then you move to season 10 of Friends and you see really any episode within that season, who she was when she started was not who she ended up being. And I don't think anybody would have expected that. She started as the girl who was running away from getting married. She worked as a barista in a coffee shop before it was cool. And next thing you know, she's getting a job working in fashion, running her own department. And it sounds like a real rags to riches kind of idea. It goes back to when you can set your own expectations and you don't play by other people's rules, and you can define what those key words mean to you. People will question it at first. They won't understand it. They won't get it. But then all of a sudden, you'll start to gain some traction. You'll start to see that once you've become laser focused in what your dreams are and what success looks like to you and what ambition looks like to you, and you start to make momentum towards those expectations, you'll be amazed at how people will all of a sudden start to see it and really be baffled at how you got there, because in a way, they felt like everyone was starting off at the same place, when really everyone's starting in a very unique and a very different place. It makes me even think of the Hunger Games and how every person starts on a platform. But if you notice, every person starts on a platform, but it's in a circle and they're in a different part of the circle. So you might be thinking you're starting at the same place, but actually it could be a few degrees off. It can be a few feet away. You're never really on the same playing field as someone else. Everybody has a different starting point. And so moving away from some of these movie ideas that we've talked about and to move into this idea that I want you to hold on to, it goes a little like this. To live by someone else's expectations can derail your entire life. You'll lose time and ultimately yourself. Peace comes defining your own expectation. So I'll read that one more time. To live by someone else's expectations can derail your entire life. You'll lose time and ultimately yourself. Peace comes when you start to define your own expectations. Basically summarizing everything that we've talked about thus far. And so now to move into some personal stories, and this will give you some context as to why I feel so strongly about this topic. The first story goes back to this idea of everybody having very unique definitions for words. So growing up, I always thought differently. And the best way I used to tell people this was, let's say like you were sitting in like a math class and somebody would ask, how did you get the number 4? And you had to create an equation. So it could be something like 2 + 2 = 4. And everybody would write down the exact same answer. It'd be 2 + 2 = 4. And then they would get to me and they'd be like, okay, Christina, how did you get to 4? And I would have all these different ideas in my head. I'd say, well, you could do 1 + 3 = 4. You could do 5 - 1 = 4. Like I would have all these different variations on how I got to 4. And at the very end, I think I would be like, oh yeah, 2 + 2 = 4 too. And a lot of times teachers just never even knew what to do with me because they were like, they couldn't even understand the way that I thought. So it was very common a lot of times for people to look at me and be like, oh my God, you're so weird. Like, we don't understand you. You are so weird. And it was so funny because a lot of times I'd go home to my mom and I'd be like, I don't get it. People call me weird all the time, but like, I understand what I'm thinking. Other people don't understand what I'm thinking. And then just like any mom does, they pull out their like bucket full of wisdom. And so my mom looked at me and she goes, everybody has their own definition of what weird means. She goes, think about what you think is weird. She goes, your definition of weird is very different than my definition of weird. And she would repeat this to me all the time growing up. And there was one day in particular, I was in high school, I was in the hallway at school, and I had run into one of my friends and we were talking about something and he's like, you are so weird. And I had gotten really fed up with people calling me weird at that point. And I had looked at him and I go, you know, your definition of weird and my definition of weird are very different. So you think I'm weird? Actually, I think you're weird. And all of a sudden he stops. I could see him processing it. And then all of a sudden he goes, okay, that makes sense. He goes, okay, sounds good. And that was it. And he walked away and he was like, his mind was blown. And this is also the reason why I have that theory about everybody having their own personalized dictionary in their head, because it also goes back to my mom. That was a moment in my life where I realized I'm like, it's true. His idea of what weird is different than my idea of what weird is. So to him, I'm weird. I am the picture of weird. And then in my world, I could look at someone like him, like, why don't you think the way that I think? That's weird. That was a story in my life that really changed how I viewed people, how I view words, how I viewed situations. Everyone has their own philosophy and idea of the way things should look and be. So a second story that I wanted to share, this happened while I was in corporate. So I had worked 2 different corporate jobs. And in my time being in corporate, I had come across this whole nother world of being ambitious. It's really interesting when you see this word ambitious played out. You have the ambitious people in high school who are trying to excel and achieve and become valedictorian. Then you have the people that are ambitious in the part-time jobs where they want to make like management. And then you meet corporate people. And their form of ambition is very different. So as I was holding an entry-level position within corporate, I'm learning more things and expanding. I started to realize in corporate, certain roles were considered more ambitious than other roles. So job titles. I would have different mentors when I was working in corporate. And anytime people would describe me, they would always say, Christina is very ambitious. That was like a synonym to who I was. As I was entering management positions and holding my own, and as I was climbing the corporate ladder and just having different conversations with different people along the way and starting to realize ambition looks different within these different roles, I had quickly learned that some roles were perceived as being more ambitious than other roles. That was something that, okay, it's one thing to kind of sense that and to feel that. And then it's another when people start to say, like, this department is not ambitious. And then it would be a blanket statement. It's very jarring when all of a sudden you're being told that you yourself are not ambitious in these moments. But it goes back to this idea of how are you defining ambition? And being in corporate, I'd started to notice it was when you held a particular role, you were deemed ambitious over another. And that was not the expectation that I had in those moments. Like I said, I had started to build these definitions in my own head with my own personalized dictionary that expectations look different. So this person's expectation looked different than my expectation. And so based on their expectation, they were correct. I was not ambitious, but based on my expectations, I was ambitious. And what was also unique is as I would talk to my mentor and other people, they would always say like, oh no, Christina is ambitious. That was a synonym. It just goes back to this thing of, like I said, you can't hold on to other people's expectations and believe them as your own, because otherwise you end up playing in this game that you were never meant to be in at all. To finish that story and to move into our very last story, and it's not so much a story, but one of the choices I had made in my life was I decided that I wasn't going to go to college. And that was something that ended up being very pivotal in my early 20s. The reason why it was really pivotal in my early 20s was, without realizing it, I held on to a lot of shame because the status quo, the normal thing, was everyone I knew was going to college. And if they weren't going to college, they were enlisting in the military. If they weren't enlisting in the military, they were going to trade school. And so I really was like this odd man out by not going to college. So for the first 5 years of my 20s, so till I was 25, really held on to all of this shame that I didn't go to college, to the point that I decided I would sign up for online classes. And I kid you not, I think I made it through 3 days and then I dropped out. So I don't even count my 3-day college courses as a college experience because I truly dropped out after 3 days. Point is, the reason why I was holding on to the shame of not going to college was because I was holding on to other people's expectations for my life. People assumed they'd say, oh, well, Christina, you're so smart, you should go to college. And something that I had really started to learn in my early 20s was I was a hands-on learner. That as much as I could enjoy sitting in the classroom and enjoy listening to a professor, I had quickly learned I really valued hands-on experience versus sitting in a classroom. And not going to college really left this cornerstone in my life. And cornerstone, it's the connecting of two things. If you're thinking about a building's foundation, it would be the corner of the building. So it left this cornerstone in my life that really started to define me, and it made me feel really insecure, and I magnified it in myself. And it's so funny because when you start to magnify your insecurities about things, it's amazing how people like you don't even know will pick up on it, and then all of a sudden it's like blood in the water and they're like sharks and they come after you. And so I had started to have these insecurities about not going to college, and I was working in a retail store when this was happening, and I would have strangers come up to me, just like out of the blue strangers. I'd ask them if they needed any help. I'd help them find things. It would be like, okay, how's your day? Good. Okay. Get ready to go on their way. And out of nowhere, they'd be like, oh, are you in college? And I'd say, oh, no, I'm not. And out of nowhere, one guy had said to me, he goes, you know, you'll never make any real money unless you go to college. And at the time I was like 22. And I just remember feeling completely defeated by that. One, I couldn't believe someone I didn't even know said that to me. It'd be one thing if a family member said that to me, but to hear a complete stranger said that to me, it was crazy. So at 22, when that stranger said I'd never make any real money, it really struck a chord with me. It really left me feeling defeated. If I could go back now and I could debunk that, and I could say at 28, the last corporate job that I had a 6-figure salary and I was the global head of my department. And I didn't have a college education. I still don't have a college education. It goes back to the very thing I've been saying this whole episode. When you're holding on to other people's expectations, you hold on to the rule book of someone else's game. People will project onto you whatever jaded or brokenness they have because they think they're helping you, but actually what they don't know is sometimes they're actually in the process of defeating you. I say all of that to give you hope that whatever the dream was that you had, however you had initially defined your dream, and then someone came along and said that's an unrealistic expectation, and that hurt. That really, really hurt. And that's one of those moments of you can't allow their jadedness or their expectations to swap out the playbook that you were meant to have for your life. It goes back to that moment of looking at these keywords. Those words like dreams, success, ambition, failure, and even knowing what fun means to you. And when you can find, and when you can also define those words, you'll find a new kind of peace because it's not dependent upon others. So if that person walks out of your life or that relationship fails, your status quo, your expectations, they don't leave with them because you defined what dreams and success and ambition and failure and even what fun means to you. So for me, when I looked at those words ambition and I would see all these hours I would spend in corporate jobs and pouring into other people's businesses, and I realized I'm working so hard, I'm working so tirelessly for someone else. What if I put all those hours into something I cared about? Those ideas of ambition, they started to change. And then you start to look at success. What does success look like to me? Is success a dollar sign? Is success a happy life? And then you start to look at dreams and you start to think, what were those things that made you come to life? What were those things that you had hoped for as a kid, but you let go because life got hard, life got messy, and the bills were due? Ultimately, you look at failures. When did failures become this idea that it's better not to try because I don't want to fail, or I don't want someone to say I was a failure? You know, sometimes it's better to try a lot of things and to realize maybe you don't like things than it is to always wonder why. And then lastly, fun. Fun has been one of those words that has been a hard word for me to describe because getting lost in jobs where I want to work really hard and I want to achieve and thinking I know what success looks like for me and then finding out success looks very different than what I would have thought. And all of a sudden fun comes into play and it's this idea of fun. It's supposed to be this moment of being able to recharge, get a reset. What does fun look like for you? Maybe it's going to the beach. Maybe it's reading a good book. And so it goes back to the idea of everyone having their own dictionary of words on how they define those things and what's important to them. And the thing is, society will try to copy and paste the same values onto you, though it's up to you to allow if those definitions will stick. And so one last idea I want to leave you with goes, somewhere over time, we exchange word definitions for picture perfect life. Though, when we exchange word definitions for the picture perfect life, and then you talk to those in the picture, and they don't define that picture perfect. So to sum this episode up into a phrase, so episode in a phrase, it would be dare to redefine expectations. And I'll repeat that. Dare to redefine expectations. Don't hold on to others' expectations because it's easier. Go out and create your own. So the quote to live by. So bear with me today on the quote to live by. I actually have 3 quotes and they all really encompass this idea of defying expectations. And they're all from Steve Jobs. So the first quote goes, an iPod, a phone, and an internet mobile communicator. These are not 3 separate devices. We are calling it an iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. Here it is. That is the line Steve Jobs said when he was announcing the very first iPhone. And I'll repeat it. He said, an iPod, a phone, an internet mobile communicator. These are not 3 separate devices. And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone. Here it is. And so just think as you are potentially listening to this through an iPhone, if Steve Jobs didn't change what the expectations of what a phone was, and he actually combined it with 3 separate devices and turned it into an iPhone, we would have never had iPhones. There's a lot of things we wouldn't have had because of Steve Jobs. So that's a quote that I think really encompasses this idea of expectations. So the second quote from Steve Jobs goes, "Sometimes when you innovate, you make mistakes. It is best to admit them quickly and get on with improving your innovations." And I'll say that one more time. Sometimes when you innovate, you make mistakes. It is best to admit them quickly and get on with improving your innovations. And I want to encourage you, sometimes you're going to define words in a particular way, and sometimes you're going to change them. This is where, when you think about someone like Steve Jobs and he comes up with these amazing technology ideas, and if he's saying you make mistakes, but you have to admit them quickly, it's part of life. It goes back to that idea of failures. If you can look at failures no longer as a defeat, but instead look at it as finding out something maybe you didn't like or maybe something you didn't do well at, and just keep moving quickly, you'll actually accomplish a lot more than most people. Now, for our last quote to live by, this was also by Steve Jobs. He said, "My favorite thing in life don't cost any money. It's really clear that the most precious resource we all have is time." And I'll say that one more time. My favorite things in life don't cost any money. It's really clear the most precious resource we all have is time. And that quote, it goes back to those ideas that we had talked about. When you live by someone else's expectations, it can derail your life and you lose time and ultimately you lose yourself. What I think is so unique about his quote about my favorite things in life don't cost any money. It's really clear the most precious resource we all have is time. It goes back to that same thing. When you hold on to someone else's expectations for your life, ultimately, time is the most valuable resource that we have. And when you hold on to someone else's expectations, you're actually losing your most valuable resource, which is your own time. So wrapping up today's episode and looking at our key takeaways. So the first one goes, everyone has their own personalized dictionary of words. It's how they define words such as success, dreams, ambitions, failures, and even fun. The second, you can't live by others' expectations for your life. Third, expectations is the ruler we judge our experiences by. 4, dare to redefine expectations. And lastly, to live by someone else's expectations can derail your entire life. You'll lose time and ultimately yourself. Peace comes when defining your own expectations. So I just want to say thank you so much for hanging out today. It was great to unravel defying expectations with you. So I'd love to connect with you more. You can connect with us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube at Let's Unravel Pod. That's at Let's Unravel Pod. If you enjoyed this week's episode or the podcast show in general, please leave a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Your comments and 5-star ratings go a long way. And please don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button anywhere you might be listening to stay up to date on any of our latest episodes. We release new episodes every single Thursday. And as always, it was great talking to you, and I'll see you soon. Bye.